Well, hello. Welcome to Black Men Speak, a podcast that features ordinary Black men doing extraordinary things. I'm your host, Keith Dent, and I just want to say if this is your first time listening today, I want to thank you for actually tuning in. And if this is not your first time, I've hoped you had a good couple of weeks. You have prepared for the summer, and you've gotten your vaccine. That's very important. I'm glad that you guys here. Well, we are into June, and June, if you did not know, is actually National Soul Food Month. And so I guess, of course, soul food has been around for a long time, but the moniker actually started in 2001 by someone named Charla Draper. She's a food editor, African-American food editor. And it was a way to celebrate our heritage and history of foods and foodways of our people and as well as the African diaspora. So soul food, as you know, often gets compared to Southern food, but we know there's a distinct difference. And so to give us a history lesson today on how African-American slaves developed soul food's distinct character by creating outstanding meals from less than desirable cuts of meat and produce. And now some of those, those soul foods, some of those same foods are now considered delicacies in certain places. So we turn to someone that is an expert, and his name is Adrian Miller. He's the author of Soul Food: The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, One Plate at a Time. He's also has two other books: Black Smoke, African American in the U.S. of Barbecue, and also The President's Kitchen Table. And we'll kind of talk about those towards the end, because there may be some great books you would want to check out, especially if you're a foodie. So Adrian Miller also is a food writer. He's a James Beard Award winner, and he's an attorney. And how he got from being an attorney to talking about food is very fascinating. We'll talk about that. He's actually also a certified barbecue judge who resides in Denver, Colorado. Also, by the way, his law degree is from Georgetown University. And so, which is fantastic. As you know, we love Georgetown here on Black Men Speak. And so if you haven't seen him yet, you probably heard his name, but he was featured in a new Netflix documentary called High on the Hog: How African-American Cuisine Transformed America. And so if you haven't seen that show yet, you have to check it out. It was literally fantastic. And not only did you learn some things, but you also just felt so just part of the story. Because if you are an African-American, you're African, you from the Caribbean, it was really all about us, and they did a very good job. So tonight he's going to talk about his journey in the food industry and how he came to write his book Soul Food, as well as his others. And then I want to discuss some origins on like fried chicken, mac and cheese, catfish, hot sauce, how they came to be part of our national treasure. I have his book. I started to read it a little bit, and it was just fascinating. So Adrian, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's good to be with you.
I'm glad you're here. So before we really get into just the history of soul food, I really want to hear just about your journey and how you went from being a lawyer. I mean, you're still a lawyer by profession, but how did you get to that, to becoming a soul food writer?
Well, the short answer is unemployment.
Okay.
The longer answer is, so I had just finished up a stint with the Clinton White House, and this is 2001. And at that time, I wanted to, my professional ambition was to become the senator from Colorado at some point. So I wanted to run for office. So I was trying to get back to my home state and town of Denver, Colorado, but the job market was really slow. So I was watching a lot of daytime television. I'm not even going to tell you what shows. And then I got to the point where I was sending him the depth of my depravity, and I just said, I should read something. So I went to the bookstore, and I'm browsing the food section because I always love to cook. And I found this book on the history of Southern food. And in that book, the author, and the book is called Southern Food at Home, on the Road, in History. So if you're into Southern food history, you should definitely read that book. And his name is John Edgerton. So Edgerton wrote that the tribute to Black American achievement in cookery has yet to be written. And I thought that was interesting. So I just emailed him because, he wrote the book in the late 80s. So I'm reading it in 2001. So I just emailed him and asked him, I said, you wrote this a while ago. Do you still think this is true? Because I was just convinced that somebody had already done that work. And he said, for the most part, people have written about parts of it, but nobody's taken on the whole story. And he said, there's always room for another voice. So why not yours? So that's what launched me on the journey.
Wow. And how long did it actually take you how long did the journey take you before you got the opportunity to actually pen the book?
So I'm going to give you chronological and then the technical, because I always had a day job. So I was doing this as a side hustle.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So technically it was 12 years from the time that I decided I was going to do this to the time that the book came out. But if you took the actual work part of it, I would say it was 4 years.
Okay.
4 years of work.
4 years of work. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And so, well, let's kind of get into it a little bit. And so what would you say, can you give me a kind of a brief synopsis of how the food we love today actually came to be called soul food? Because as I mentioned in the first part, is that, as you know, soul food kind of came from, the cuts of meat that, or the scraps that people wouldn't use, or if we want to say the slave owners wouldn't use. So how did it become to be called such a name that we're so endeared to?
Yeah, so there's really two parts to the story. So let's just talk about the linguistic part.
Okay.
Well, the words soul and food were actually joined together in English back in Shakespeare's time. So one of Shakespeare's first play, The Two Gentlemen of Verona, there are two female characters, Julia and Lucetta, talking about this sexy guy named Proteus. And he walks by in a scene, and Julia says to Lucetta, "Oh, knowest thou not that his looks are my soul's food? Pity the death that I've pined in by longing for that food so long a time." So, even in the late 16th century, not unusual for two girlfriends to get together and describe a guy's yummy. That's one takeaway.
So that's where snack came from.
Yeah. So, but for the next 400 years in English, soul food meant anything to edify your spiritual life. So it was reading a sermon, listening to a sermon, reading scriptures, singing hymns. And then fast forward to the 1940s, it takes a musical turn. So you have these Black jazz artists who are pretty miffed because white jazz artists were the ones who were getting the most gigs, the most fame, and making the most money. So these jazz artists said, you know what? We're going to take this music to a place where we know white musicians cannot mimic the sound. And that was the sound of the Black church in the rural South. So the gospel-tinged jazz that emerges in the late 40s and early 50s, these jazz artists started describing it as soul and funky. So soul is the one that gains currency. And so it was really soul music first, and then it was soul brothers, soul sisters, soul food. So soul food was floating around in Black culture in the 50s, well before the civil rights movement. In fact, the earliest ad that I could find of a Black restaurant advertising for soul food was from a Los Angeles paper in 1960. So that just shows you it was floating around before this, because a lot of people say it was really the Black Power movement, civil rights movement, but that wasn't really peaking until the mid 60s.
Okay.
So it was floating around. So that's the linguistic part. So the food part, I'm actually going to expand what you said, because certainly the taking the lesser cuts of meat is part of the story.
Okay.
And that's really the legacy of hog killings in the South, because what they would do is once the weather cooled enough, they would, people in the plantations nearby, they would all kind of get together and kill all of their hogs at one time, because it's quite an endeavor. And they wanted to pool as much labor as possible to get this stuff done. And so in the ways that the pigs were processed, African Americans got certain cuts, and then the big house, the slaveholder, got certain cuts. But soul food is much more complex. That's part of the story, but soul food is really the bringing together of West Africa, Europe, and the Americas. So there's a lot more food that goes into it. In fact, a lot of the things we think of as soul food desserts, if you looked at their pedigree, they actually are high class British desserts that get embraced by Black cooks. The same thing is with macaroni and cheese. I mean, we think of macaroni and cheese as this everyday thing, but man, like 800 years ago, it was royalty food.
What? Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So a lot of these things have a really complex story.
Right. Right. And so, I know, I think in the documentary, they touched upon this a little bit, but really the food that our ancestors were used to eating was mostly vegan, they had touched upon. And so, which partly I can understand that. And, they even talk about that in the Bible about, how that brings strength, that kind of diet. But why did that change?
So it changed because of the change in context, right? So people were coming from an environment where they had existed for thousands of years. And so they were in tune with their ecosystem, but they get uprooted from that and they're put into this alien situation. So when you're forced migrants or immigrants by choice, when you get to the new place, part of the human struggle is try to recreate home. And if you can do that with the same stuff you got from back home, you do that. But often you have to find substitutes or you have to embrace things that are new. What we know about slavery is that slaveholders controlled access to food, or at least they tried to as much as they could. The enslaved access for food. So essentially, enslaved people were given rations once a week. And it was usually 5 pounds of some starch, a couple of pounds of smoked meat, and a jug of molasses. And so other than that, enslaved people had to figure out how to, supplement their diet. And so they did that by hunting, foraging, fishing, gardening, all kinds of things like that. So I think it's really just being put into essentially a foreign land under a European context. And European diet is very meat-centered. That causes a transition with enslaved people. But even with all of that disruption in their lives and their culinary traditions, some things do come back. And so I think a lot of people who are steeped in Southern food and soul food know that vegetables play a huge part in the cuisine. And, you can go to a lot of soul food places and they have a vegetable plate. Now, it's not completely vegan because, it's seasoned with meat a lot of the times, but still they have vegetable plates. And that's part of our tradition. And so is gardening, urban farming, all of that is part of our tradition.
So, I mean, I just wanted to talk about, so they were allowed to actually go out and hunt, but for slaves, they had to be within a certain, wasn't there fear that they would be leaving? So I'd love to touch upon how that came about, because it's not something you really hear. When you think about slavery, they're enclosed in a certain other plantation and they only can go so far. I'd love to hear some more details about that.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest kind of untold stories about slavery, is the extent to which enslaved people were kind of given some liberties. And so as you get closer to looking at slavery and listening to the testimony of enslaved people and stuff, you realize that people were frequently given passes to visit nearby plantations. Sometimes there were marriages that happened that way. Somebody would marry somebody on a nearby plantation and things like that. So there was a lot more fluidity in this system than you might think. But superseding that was the slave patrols and all this stuff, because the slave owners were worried about escape. But there was some permissiveness, in that. And I would love to read a more extensive study of this, but it's something I just noted because, like you, I just didn't think that enslaved people would be allowed to hunt, and that they would have firearms in some instances, but most times they didn't. And so they had to figure out how to, hunt with improvised weapons in order to kill the animals. So, it's something that requires a lot more study. But we know that enslaved people were allowed to hunt as long as the work was done. They were allowed to hunt and garden. And so, if people could do it at night, if there was a full moon, there was enough light to do it, they would do so. But a lot of times people were just too tired. So a lot of these activities would happen on the weekends or when the work schedule slowed.
Right. Okay. Okay. And so, and I know it's a lot to cover, but if you could kind of tell us how soul food has changed with the times, from the time that it's actually got its name to now, if there has been, and has there been any changes?
Yeah. So, part of it is the change in context from a rural context to an urban context. So when we think of soul food, that name really, as I said, doesn't come until the 20th century, and this is well into the Great Migration. And so it's interesting. All of this was called Southern cooking during the antebellum period and in Reconstruction, the latter part of the 1800s. But when people start leaving the South, it starts to get another name. So before soul food, a lot of this food was called down home cooking.
Okay.
And it was literally down because people in the North or whatever, and they were looking back on where they came from. And so geographically, they were North. And so they would call it down home cooking. And then later it becomes soul food. So this stuff gets a name when it leaves the South. So one of the things that was a big change is the increase in meat and kind of fried foods and all these other things. So what I argue in my book, this is just my theory, but I think it plays out, is that what we call soul food is really the celebration food of the South. So it's the stuff that people were eating when the work schedule slowed, either on the weekends or on holidays. So things like fried chicken, fried fish, barbecue, the glorious cakes, biscuits, all of that stuff. That only happened when cooks had enough time to make that. And usually that was when the work schedule slowed. And so it was once in a while food. It was celebration food. So again, in another migrant context, when people leave a place and get to a new place, besides recreating home, they want to enjoy some status. And so once people prosper and feel like they are in a better place, they remember the good times food from the old country, quote unquote.
Right.
The old country was the rural South. So they were grubbing on fried chicken and barbecue and stuff multiple times a week instead of every once in a while. So all of this stuff that was special occasion food starts to become more of the core diet. When that happens, that's when you start to see, the health consequences arise. The other thing is when you get to a new place, you've got new neighbors, right? You're exposed to other cultures. And so it's up to you whether you decide to experiment with what other people are eating and other things. So one of the other big changes in the African-American diet is the inclusion of Mexican food, Italian food, Chinese food, other foods from these new neighbors. And then I would say the fourth biggest change is and I'm going to group two different food groups together, but the rise of convenience food. So the availability of fast food and food at gas stations and, convenience stores and all this kind of stuff. To me, that is what has really had the deleterious effects on African-American health. Soul food gets blamed for a lot of this, but I think people are loading up on that other stuff, man. Fast food.
Wow. Okay.
Food, yeah.
I would think that soul food does get a bad rap because, one, from what you're saying, this is not something that we eat all the time. It was more used for celebrations, I guess, birthdays, Christmas, New Year's, what have you. But it's the other foods, the fast foods that are more the day to day, and then for a whole host of reasons, just due lack of food access, costs and things of that nature, which have caused us to kind of go that direction, and blame soul food kind of gets the blame for that.
Yeah. And if I can just elaborate on your question in another way. So I like to talk about the current trends in soul food. So in addition to traditional soul food, you've got down home healthy. And so the idea is to take out the fat, the salt, and the sugar with dishes that are normally associated with soul food. Then you've got upscale, which is doubling down on all the glorious stuff, and emphasis on presentation, heirloom vegetables, heritage meat. But I got to tell you, the most creativity right now is in the vegan space.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. That's the hot trend in soul food right now.
What when you say the most creative, the hot trend, how are chefs how are they doing that, and how are they getting? Because we're not ones to be vegetarians for the most part. So, so how are they, using their, I guess, skills to get people, to draw people to that?
So there's two ways, right? One is to make things that taste like what people are used to in terms of meat, and make it look and taste as much as they can. So that's a lot of the market right now with the plant-based things. But I'll give you an example. I went to a place called Solely Vegan in Oakland, California, and I had southern fried tofu that was shaped to look like fried chicken. I had vegan mac and cheese. So there's no dairy in vegan, right? So it was made with almond milk and almond cheese. And I had collard greens that, they were seasoned so well that you didn't even miss the meat, and a cayenne pepper lemonade. So that's one thing that people are doing. So they're just making, meatless versions of something that people recognize. And the other is people are just saying, nope, we're just going to make really incredible vegetables. And we're just going to ask you to just taste it and try it, and you'll be hooked. So those are the approaches that I'm seeing. And part of it has a cultural lens in that people are saying, we're trying to get back to the foods our ancestors ate, the way that they ate. Because our culinary heritage was disrupted by slavery, and our plates have been colonized. So let's decolonize and get back to where our ancestors were eating.
Right. Hey, it sounds good. And so I think, and a lot of people don't realize that was that was more of our history, and to get back to that, because it's, of course, marketing and all that other stuff is very powerful, and especially the meat industry. And so if we can, but it's a matter of trying. It's really that's a matter of trying and going in with an open mind, and let your taste buds do the talking.
Yes, absolutely. Because a lot of people just have an attitude about it. But we're a culture where we're weaned on meat, right? And so it's going to take an adjustment for some people to do that. But once they have this food, I'm telling you, man, it's just creative. It's delicious. So I just love what's happening. I'm not vegetarian. I still eat meat, but I eat a lot of this other stuff. And the only thing I will point out is fusion. So you're seeing a lot of African American food fused with other cuisines. So like there's a brother in Atlanta who calls himself the Blaxican.
Okay,
that's his name, not mine. So he's doing things like collard green quesadillas. And then the other thing is, you probably have seen soul food filled egg rolls, right? So soul rolls. So like an egg roll filled with collard greens, or mac and cheese, chicken, rice, and gravy, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm in Jersey. I haven't heard any of those. I haven't seen any of those yet.
I'm surprised, actually.
Which is interesting. Because I think I heard it on the Netflix show, and I was like, oh wow, soul rolls, interesting. Okay, we can do anything with our stuff. So
oh yeah.
So that's a great segue into and I know I picked a few their origin story, but I picked the the kind of the mainstays, fried chicken, mac and cheese, and catfish. But there may be one that would blow people away as far as how it became soul food. So I'll give you a couple, and then maybe you may throw in a zinger for me. So fried chicken, because I'm actually on that chapter now in the book, and I was fascinated to hear that this is not actually, it didn't originate from us. So I'd love to hear that.
Yeah. So and first of all, you should know that when I started writing that chapter, I wanted to prove that fried chicken was from Africa, because it's one of the most delicious things on the planet. And you have the constituent parts, right? Because you have chickens, you have a tradition of deep frying foods, and so many other things. But the way that West Africans eat chicken is not fried chicken. They don't like cut it into parts, like big parts, flour it, or put it in a batter and deep fry it. West Africans are often breaking down a chicken into much smaller parts, cooking it in some kind of sauce. So it's more like a fricassee approach.
Okay.
So what I did, but the earliest written recipe that I could find for fried chicken was from a British cookbook in the mid 1700s, and that recipe, they said to marinate chickens. That was the title of the recipe. But when you look at it, it's just like get a chicken, butcher it into large parts, flour it, and fry in hog lard. Wow. You look at the Virginia housewife 100 years later, which is considered the quintessential Southern fried chicken recipe, and it's pretty much the same thing. and there's additional stuff for gravy, but that's how you make it. So my thought is that fried chicken was introduced by European slaveholders, and enslaved cooks were forced to make this dish. Numerous times, innumerable times, and raised it to an art form. And it's a similar, you see that similarly with other foods.
Okay. And so so to double down on that, what was the first recipe that you found of a Black chef or a cook that actually made fried chicken? Did you ever find one?
Oh, that was actually printed in that person's words?
Yes.
I think Abby Fisher in the 1880s, because there was another book by another woman, Melinda Russell, and that was written in 1866, and that's believed to be the first kind of cookbook by an African American woman who was a cook. Because there's some earlier books, but they were servant guides.
Okay.
That were printed a couple decades before that. I just don't remember seeing a fried chicken recipe in that book.
Okay.
So it's either one of those, but I know there's one in the Abby Fisher book written in the 1880s.
Okay. All right. And then mac and cheese.
So mac and cheese is interesting. So it starts off as European food. So in 1390, there was a cookbook called The Form of Curry, which was the go-to cookbook for Richard II and Elizabeth I. So their cooks were cooking out of this book, and there's a recipe for macros, MACROWS, and it's macaroni and cheese. And so essentially it's the noodles, Parmesan cheese, and some butter. So starts out as royalty food, and then in time it becomes wealthy people's food. And so when wealthy Southerners are traveling abroad, they experience this dish, and they bring recipes back home and start making it in Southern kitchens. Most notably, Thomas Jefferson did this. And so you see a lot of references in manuscript cookbooks in the 1700s and 1800s to macaroni pie or macaroni pudding. That's what people called it before we started to call it macaroni and cheese. And so, like I said earlier, with another dish, it enters African American cooking because enslaved cooks were forced to make this stuff. So, fried chicken is the same story. And again, we raise it to an art form.
Okay. Well, what about our beloved hot sauce?
Yeah, so hot sauce is interesting because West Africans before European contact had kind of hot chilies in their diet, but not the chilies we know, like not the chilies from South America, which are called capsicum. But they had their own kind of grains of paradise, Melagetta pepper, and then ginger and cardamom. So they had a lot of warming spices in their cuisine. So what I say is that the African tongue was hot wired for these New World chilies when they arrive there, and then they get embraced. So heavily used in cooking and everything. So, but the idea of a condiment, we really see that first in the Caribbean. There are some notes from Europeans who are in the Caribbean, and they're talking about how the indigenous people would make a sauce using citrus juice and chilies. And I believe that hot sauce is just an analog of that, right? Instead of the citrus juice, which may be harder to have, especially at that time, right? Without refrigeration, you have a real chance of that spoiling. So swapping vinegar in for the citrus, and then using cayenne pepper, which was more readily available than, say, the hotter chilies like Scotch bonnet and habanero, which indigenous people were using in the Caribbean. And the interesting thing is that on the plantations, hot sauce was healthcare. Because through trial and error, slaveholders found out that increasing the number of peppers, or chilies as I call them, that people ate actually reduced the incidence of some diseases.
Right. And I know Hillary Clinton loves her hot sauce. I know I heard that story. She likes to drink it. So I guess maybe she got that from you. Who knows? And so is there a surprise? Is there a surprised food that we would really be blown away as far as their origin into our
so I think the one that really surprises people is chitlins, because chitlins fits the whole narrative of the master's leftovers, the food they didn't want, we got the extras. But if you delve into European culinary history, man, chitlins was a highly esteemed dish. Especially after a hunt, they would eat the innards of that animal. A lot of cultures believe that the guts of an animal holds the life force, and that's a belief that's prevalent in a lot of West African societies. So I could see that coming across the Atlantic during the slave trade and transferred from their native animals to, the introduced ones like a pig. And so, and they're actually in the slave narratives that I've read, you've got instances of slaveholders, instructing their cook to make chitlins. And in one case, one enslaved person talked about being beaten because they didn't make the chitlins well enough. So there's a lot of white people eating chitlins. So I think that's the one that shocks people the most. And I like telling that history because I'm trying to get people to rethink what they think about soul food. It's not trash. It's not all the master's leftovers. That's part of the narrative, but it's much more complex than that.
Where were you 10 years ago when my kids had to do a bring a food of your culture, and I was like, chitlins, definitely, and that doesn't necessarily go well.
Yeah, it's a hard one.
Oh man, I could have really sold that, but that is fascinating because it does get a bad rap as far as because it's the innards or it's kind of the leftovers, and so that's great to know. So let's transition a little bit because you were in the Netflix series High on the Hog, which is, like I said, it was fascinating. It was great. I think I watched it in 2 days. But one of the things that came up, which I know, and I had not heard anything about this, were the 2 Black chefs that were part of the president's. They were their president's chefs. So President Washington and President Jefferson.
Yeah. So the first one. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So the first one is with President Washington was a guy named Hercules. So Hercules, just to give you a quick bio on him, Hercules was purchased as a young man. He was 19 years old. He was a boat ferryman for a guy named John Posey. And the Washingtons purchased him. Now, remember, Washington married up. So Martha Washington was the wealthy widow that he married. So really, it was part of her estate. But for whatever reason, they make him go cook in Mount Vernon. And he apprenticed under an old an African-American woman named Old Doll, also enslaved. So when years later, when Washington becomes president, he summons Hercules from the Mount Vernon kitchen to cook for him at the president's house in Philadelphia. The president's house was in Philadelphia because DC was being constructed. Now, Washington had actually previously hired a white woman, but I guess her food was nasty because she only lasted 6 months, and he calls up Hercules. So there was really only one problem among others, but the chief problem is Pennsylvania had something called the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, which said if you were an enslaved person on Pennsylvania soil for 6 months or longer, you were automatically free. So the way that Washington got around this is just around the time the 6-month deadline was told, he would send the enslaved people outside of the state, chill them out for a little while, and then bring them back.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. I was like, wow.
I know. It's messed up, right?
How sinister that is,
Yeah.
And then, of course, as we know, Sally Heming, but then there was James Heming.
Yeah, so James Hemings, again, a young man, around 19 or so, he goes. Now, Jefferson had owned him, but around he was 19, Jefferson brings him to France when Jefferson becomes minister to France. That's equivalent of being an ambassador today. Mm-hmm. So he's minister to France. He has Hemings trained to be a professional French chef. So for 3 years, Jefferson spends a lot of money for this guy to be a chef. And he, after he finishes that training, he becomes Jefferson's resident chef in his Champs-Élysées Parisian apartment. And the French, the French Revolution breaks out, so they come back, and so he's cooking for him in Philadelphia and eventually back in Monticello. But at some point, Hemings asked to be free, and Jefferson agrees upon 2 conditions. He has to teach other enslaved people back at Monticello how he cooks, because Jefferson didn't want to expend that money again, and then he had to leave behind some recipes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm convinced that Hemmings, we're cheating a little bit by talking about Hemmings in this context because he never actually cooks for Jefferson when he becomes president. I'm actually convinced that he would have been offered the job. I don't know if he would have taken it, but he drank himself to death before Jefferson gets inaugurated.
Right. Well, just say one of my friends ordered the book, so shout out to Joe Winters. Thanks, Joe, for supporting, because it is a fascinating read. So I know you wrote the book about the presidents, and so were there any other Black executive chefs that served in the White House that we probably don't know about that we could talk about here?
Yeah, I would say we probably don't know about any of them. So not all of them were head chefs, but I have found 150 African Americans have cooked for presidents since George Washington. So every president's had an African American cooking for them in some capacity, either in the White House, at somebody's house when they come to visit, or on the way as they are traveling. So on the presidential train, the yacht, or Air Force One. So African Americans have had a strong influence on African American history. So one person I'd like to make, and she was only the executive chef for a short period of time because she was transitional in this role, but Zephyr Wright, who was the longtime cook for Lyndon Johnson. A lot of people think that, a lot of people say that it was because of her cooking that Johnson rose in Congress, because back then members of Congress actually tried to be collegial. So they would have each other for dinner. And very few people turned down, invitation from Johnson, knowing that Zephyr was going to be cooking. But Johnson uses her Jim Crow experiences to lobby for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And when he signed the bill, they always use a ton of pens. He gave her one of the 72 pens that he used to sign the bill and said, "You deserve this as much as anyone."
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah. So she is now she was only in this role for a little bit because Johnson hated the French chef that he inherited from the Kennedys. And the French chef was not feeling making Johnson's Southern and Tex-Mex favorites. Like, you've ever heard of chili con queso?
Oh, yeah, I have.
Yeah. So Rene Verdon called it chili concrete. So that gives you an idea how he felt about it.
Yeah. Oh man, that's not great.
Yeah. So when he got fired, as they were waiting to hire the next guy, who would be Henry Haller, Zephyr Wright was the executive chef in that role. Otherwise, she was always the private cook, the family cook.
Oh, I see. Okay.
During the presidency. Yeah.
Okay, great. So one of the things and I want to go back kind of the James Hemming Hercules thing, because that's fascinating. So as you were talking about, I was like, wow, they could have been featured a little bit in Hamilton, but of course they weren't because it was about Hamilton. But
right.
Why haven't we heard more stories about them?
Yeah, well, no, that's an interesting point because speaking of Hamilton, so the idea of the deal that was struck to create DC and all this stuff, a lot of this was done over a dinner, and it's widely believed that Hemmings probably cooked that dinner. Where Hamilton, Jefferson, and I can't remember. I don't know if it was Adams.
Oh, in the room where it happened. Yeah.
Yeah, in the room where it happened. So we don't know for sure, but it's highly likely that Hemmings cooked that meal. We don't hear much about these people because there's just a focus on the white people in presidential history. The people who decide what stories get told about presidents usually focus on the whites. And this is in general, right? We don't hear a lot about the servants, whether enslaved or free. So that's just been the bias. So I felt honored to collect these stories and be able to tell them and share them with others. But I got to tell you, I made my pitches to all the major networks to try to make a documentary out of this, and nobody was feeling it. I kept being told, "Oh, this is interesting, but we just don't think there's much of an audience for this." Now, this was pre-Hamilton. It was 6 years ago, so maybe so maybe there's an audience now. But I was told that there wasn't an audience.
Yeah, I think it would be fascinating because you don't even think of it. You really, you do think they're in the White House and they're doing a job. Of course, they have to eat and stuff like that. But you don't. It's fact that Jefferson sent Hemmings over to France to learn how to cook, and then the depths that George Washington went through just to make sure he ensured that Hercules stayed. So that, because that takes some real thought, not just so that I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, and Washington was very vindictive, had a volcanic temper, and so he was highly upset when eventually Hercules did escape. And I mean, a year later, he was trying to track down that brother, and never did before he died. So so it's quite a story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you ventured, in your, in the soul food, doing the research. Of course, you went to a lot of different restaurants. So I'd love to hear, from a regional, perspective, what was one of your favorites in kind of each region, and hopefully they're still around, just because of the pandemic. But I'd love to hear, what was your favorite in the South, West, Midwest, and of course I'm in the East Coast. So
yeah. So it's funny that you say that, because I just got interviewed by Forbes magazine for this very question, and my all-time favorite soul food restaurant has closed.
Wow.
I'm so sad about it. It was called Bully's Soul Food in Jackson, Mississippi. So dig this. It was the kind of soul food place where off the main dining room there was a table, and somebody on staff would come out and strip greens and peel sweet potatoes periodically.
Oh, wow.
I know, man. So you knew you were getting fresh stuff.
Yes, you did. Wow.
Yeah. The blackberry cobbler at that place was just a revelation. So anyway, yeah, you guys, so that's not open any longer. There was a place in New York City that I liked a lot. It was called Mitchell's. It was in Brooklyn. That closed. But of the places in New York City that I like a lot, there's a place called the Boulevard, BLVD. Great soul food place. I like Amy Ruth's, and I love the Seasoned Vegan.
Okay.
That's some next level vegan food, man, in Harlem.
Okay.
Yeah. Then you've got the Florida Avenue Grill in Washington, D.C., which is the oldest continuously operating soul food joint in the world. And then so let's see, in the South, I would say that Busy Bee Cafe in Atlanta is a place that I really like. Then going to the West, I like that solely vegan place, and in Los Angeles, I like a place called Doolin's.
Okay.
But in Chicago, man, I gotta tell you, the places that I really liked have all closed. I really like this place called the Morrison Avenue Cafe. Man, that place, the after dinner, after church crowd, man, was just legendary. The line out the block, man. So you
Really?
all those, those black women in their crowns.
Yeah, absolutely.
That takeout stuff. Yeah. So, no, the pandemic. Well, it was not only the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic accelerated some of this, but a combination of being a generational moment, because a lot of these joints were opened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so the people running these places have either retired or they're dying, and the kids are just not interested in running the place. Because, truth be told, running a restaurant it's hard work.
It is hard work. Yeah, it is hard work, and the margins are so thin.
Yeah.
That and of course they saw their families, they saw their parents doing it and the grandparents, and they realized how much time it takes. And they want to do other stuff. Yeah.
Oh, one more place. Closer to you. So in Philadelphia, I love this place called Deborah's Kitchen.
Okay.
I can't tell you what part of town it's in, but yeah, I really like that place.
Okay. Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. And so, I mean, and I know you touched upon it a little bit, and I want to make sure there's nothing more, but you had mentioned that soul food is there's a change. People are adding fusion, other types of food, to create a kind of a soul food flavor, and then also the more vegan style or vegetarian style. So then kind of additional question, how has I guess African Americans, how have they taken to it? Because that doesn't, even though those chefs are there, doesn't necessarily mean we are actually going. So so I'd love to have you notice that we're taking to the change in how soul food is being done.
Oh yeah, especially the well, let me put it this way. Most soul food joints now are vegan in terms of their side dishes. So
Okay.
they'll have meat on the menu, but they've gone vegan and how they make their greens and other things.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, because you can get the broadest customer base, right? It's a great business decision because if you go vegan with just your side dishes, you get all the vegans, you get all the vegetarians, and then you're going to get the meat people too because they're there to get their, smothered pork chops or fried chicken, but they actually might feel good about, oh, okay, I'm being a little bit healthier by having these vegan side dishes. So there was a time when a lot of people, soul food restaurateurs, switched from pork to smoked turkey for a healthier vibe. But now you'd be surprised how many have taken the meat out altogether. You'd be really surprised. And then I've a lot of support, a lot of love for vegan. A lot of vegan restaurants are doing quite well across the country. Like vegan soul or black vegan places. And then the other thing that's been really interesting that you're starting to see emerge is this. You've got more and more restaurants and chefs trying to do the diasporic connection. And what I mean by that is they're trying to show the connections between West Africa and what we eat here. And they're intentionally doing that in their dishes. And I think that's exciting because that's just another way to show our story and to tell more people about our history. So I hope that trend really catches on. There's a few chefs doing it right now. So I'm not trying to say it's widespread, but
Right.
man, I think that'd be really cool if it did become widespread.
And that's interesting. So and I have one other thing, and I'll get to that in a minute, but how do you think it got lost? Do you think it's just because of slavery, or is it, was there, and they weren't allowed to kind of keep the traditions, or was it something else?
I think it's complex, but I think a major part of it is slavery because white slaveholders and the culture that surrounded it were trying to obliterate a black past. They didn't want people, and as well as do as much to strip these people of their humanity because they were just commodities. But we see the resilience and the triumph of African Americans in that, despite all the horrible things thrown at us, we're still here, and we still have remnants of our culture. And then, as part of the the enslavement and the mindset created by that, there was this negativity associated with anything from Africa. So why would the was planting the seed that why would you hold on to anything from Africa? As nothing good comes from Africa. And so I think those who embrace that mindset are culpable in not passing on these traditions. Now, fortunately, we've had those storytellers, we call them griots and other things, who kept our culture alive. And the exciting thing about scholarship in at least the 20th century and now is we've got more and more people of color interested in going deep into their past and trying to show that story of how we got here. So I think it's like purposeful blurring of memory by whites. And then, to some extent we played into that. And then the third thing I would say is I really think it's just the rise of fast food and convenience culture shifted our meal patterns away from traditional soul food.
Mm-hmm.
People are just eating a lot of other stuff. And so, I have parents that tell me, yeah, we had mac and cheese for dinner, but they're having it out of the blue box and there's no connection to like, oh,
Right.
well, we used to do this as Sunday dinner back then. It's just like, I've been working all day. I got these kids yelling at me. I need to get them fed. Let me
Right.
Yeah,
So one of the things, because we talk about West Africa, one of the things that was so fascinating that I saw was the yam. Because I was wondering, I was like, what are these big long things that they're, and that was the yam. So, but for the most part, we don't eat yams in this country. Is that correct?
That's correct. Now, I'm sure some of your listeners are like, what? I got yams every, Thanksgiving, blah, blah, blah. What we call yams in this country are dark fleshed sweet potatoes. They're not the tropical yams of West Africa. And the reason that happened is in the 1920s, some Louisiana sweet potato farmers said, we need to distinguish our product in the market. So they bred a darker fleshed, so more orange and sweeter sweet potato, and they called that yams. And so that's where that comes from. That's why on Thanksgiving, you can walk in a supermarket. There's a big old bin, and on one side it says yams, and on the other side it says sweet potatoes. But botanically speaking, they're the same thing.
Oh, wow. Okay. But they just use the word.
Yeah, we just use the word. And so what is interesting though is if you go back and start looking at early recipes and dishes, it's clear that West African cooks enslaved on this side of the Atlantic, in a different context, use sweet potatoes as a substitute. It was close enough to something they were used to, and so it becomes a substitute. And there are cases where enslaved people who were from yam eating countries, or yam eating, they weren't countries really by then, but yam eating areas of West Africa, were actually pleading with the slave owners to let them have sweet potatoes as the starch that based their rations instead of cornmeal or rice.
Mm.
And again, that's because that was something that looked familiar.
Right. And so what is have you had a yam? What's the difference in taste between the two?
So a yam is going to be very similar to what we think of as potatoes. So the one that's memorable to me is I had something called fufu, which is pounded yam. And so it's pounded really to be the consistency of mashed potato. It's pliable. And the idea is that, you have the typical meal in West Africa is a starch served with some savory soup, stew, or sauce. So you break off some of the yam and scoop up that sauce in another dish or fish or whatever it is, and you kind of eat with your fingers.
Oh, okay.
So it's a vessel to get something in. So, it makes sense that it's neutral in taste because you have this really incredible, usually soup, stew, or sauce that's served with it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it doesn't really taste like anything, really. I mean,
so it doesn't really have a taste, right?
Yeah. Those are the yams that I've had. I'm sure there are multiple types of yams. I know there are. Maybe they have a distinctive taste, but everything that I've had, it's been, it's the same as mashed potatoes. It's a vessel really for something else, unless you season it in a certain way.
Right. Yeah. So a yam pie is not going to do it.
Right. Yeah. It would. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. I have really thoroughly enjoyed this brief history. I know it's so enriching and deep, and I can't wait to delve more into the book. So I'm definitely, if I have questions, I'll email you. But one of the things that we always do on the show, because I know you're doing extraordinary things, but we don't always, especially as men, get in touch with how we're feeling, just individually and personally. So I always end the question is, what is on your mind as a Black man? How are you feeling? And so, whatever you feel you want to talk about, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks, man. I'm glad you asked that. So, I'm just wondering, okay, we've had a lot of white people reading books about how to be anti-racist. We've had the discussions. So I'm just wondering, are we really going to have a moment where we do start rolling up our sleeves and working towards racial justice? Because usually we've had moments in the past that could have sparked what we've experienced over the last year. But they're usually fleeting, right? After 2 months of attention, we're off to the next thing. I have to say that's not the case. I know personally, a lot of white people who are grappling with these things. My sense is they just don't know what to do, but they are grappling with it. Now, there's a lot of people who aren't. Just don't get that twisted. But there are quite a few that I know who are. So I've been wondering, can we really make progress in this moment without losing it? So I'm thinking about that, and it just mourns. I just mourn that so many people still get killed,
Right.
And are getting killed, and it's just kind of like that just how can we stop this? The level of violence, disrespect, all of the from ranging from microaggressions to just outright being murdered. How can we get to a point with racial justice where we feel like we're a part of the society and fully accepted, fully embraced?
Great. And I know that's kind of part of your other work that you do, working with churches around social justice. And so what are the clergy saying? What are they also grappling with those things, and how to kind of actually take action? Because of course, back in the day, that was we turned to the church and they would tell us the action we would take, of course, led the civil rights movement and those other things.
Yeah.
And so are they struggling with that now?
So it depends on who you talk to. So the Black clergy aren't, right? They're definitely pressing for racial justice, that they're all about it. I think the difference between now and say the civil rights movement is the civil rights movement, Black, maybe reluctantly, but white clergy a lot of white clergy were walking arm in arm with black folks then. That's
Right.
not so much the case now. When I talk to white pastors, they are reluctant to get into the fray because of the people sitting in their pews. And the people sitting in their pews, they want church to be a refuge. So all of the noise of the outside world, they don't want to deal with that. They want a place where they can get away from that.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, I got pastors just like, look, if I say Black Lives Matter in a sermon, people get up and leave. Now, dig that. In a church,
Wow.
people are leaving, right? So I understand their impulse to play it safe, but ultimately what I tell them is I said, okay, that dude you profess to follow, Jesus Christ? This is the stuff you'd be talking about.
Right.
He was talking about social justice. So there's that. And the second thing is you wonder why there's not young people in your church. They see that you're not doing anything and they care. And so they're going to other places where they can do this stuff, because one thing that was undeniable during the George Floyd, protests and everything, George Floyd inspired protests, is you saw a lot of young people, a lot of white young people out there in the streets.
Right.
And I don't know if we've seen it that much to that extent before. So I have to tell you, man, I'm a little, I haven't given up, and I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but even doing racial justice work in the church is tough. And I just thought, given our common theology, it was a space where there could be not only collaboration, but we could actually teach others how to do this, right? But the faith community's got problems as well as much as anybody. So, and I'll just leave you with this one final thought. So at the council, I run the Colorado Council of Churches, and I've been doing it for 8 years. I can just tell you this: whenever I do any kind of email communication that explicitly talks about racial justice, I will get unsubscribes.
Wow. Unsubscribes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a tough thing to think about, just especially from clergy, because it is supposed to be about Jesus Christ, and
Right.
and we know there are black people in the Bible and everything else. So the fact that it's automatically unsubscribed just because you want to have the conversation, not that we were
right.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so what we get on the other side of the equation is black clergy are just deeply cynical about the white church. Because I've tried to bring black and white churches together, and the black pastor will say, hey, look, man, we've seen this movie before. These white churches, they just want us to come on Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday, preach a sermon so they can check off a box. That's all they really want to do. They don't want to roll up their sleeves and do the hard work of racial justice. And I got to tell you, their cynicism is borne out from what I've seen. Now, I will say this. A lot of the empirical evidence that I have was before George Floyd's murder and the other significant murders, right? So in this time of a rush to affirm African Americans and protest, there are a lot more white churches trying to do the work. They've started racial justice committees. I met with a white pastor a couple of days ago. He's like, look, reparations need to happen, and the church needs to lead the way. So, I gave him a dose of cold water, and I said, look, man, I know I appreciate your thought, but this is just even on racial dialogue, I can't even make progress. So I don't know how we're going to get to reparations, but hey, we should try.
Well, I think if you can infuse some soul food in there and somehow everyone loves soul food, that might be able to foster some communication. So if anybody can do it, you would be the person to do it. So Adrian, I just wanted to thank you for being on today to give us a little history of soul food, as well as other thing. I can't wait. Definitely want to bring you back on once I get to this book, talk about barbecue, because that's the trick right there. And I just appreciate all that you've done to advance this work and let people know the origin and history.
All right, Keith. Well, good to be with you, man. Thank you.
All right. So you have a great day.
All right. Peace.
Okay. Peace. Well, that was a great show tonight. Talking about the history. If you want to catch past shows, you can. And Adrian, you can hold on a minute. You want to catch past shows, you can find these live streams as a podcast on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your favorite podcast. And look forward to seeing you. We'll be back again next week because in 2 weeks it'll be Father's Day, and so we won't be doing a show then. But I thank you for all you guys all for coming. And so you guys have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon.